Hello everyone, today's question is asking if narcissists ever feel guilt for their actions or their behaviour. Now, many people who've been on the wrong end of a narcissist might just immediately say no they don't, because if they did feel guilt, then why do they keep doing the same things over and over again? But the answer isn't always that straightforward. So to answer this question fully, I think first of all it is important to define what we mean by guilt. Although it can be closely associated with shame and regret, they're not the same things. Guilt is something we feel whenever we think about the consequences of something we have done or perhaps neglected to do, and it can help us to regulate our behaviour. So if narcissists experience feelings of guilt, then why does the behaviour continue? Sometimes why does it even get worse over time? Well, narcissism exists on a spectrum. There can be low-level traits right up to a personality disorder, and the key word here is disorder. The traits are extremely high, long-term, and pervasive. And much of the literature on narcissistic personality disorder suggests that narcissists have impaired self-reflection, and this limits their ability to process guilt into something transformative which can enable growth. And their emotional landscape tends to be dominated by self-protection rather than introspection. And quite commonly what you find is they keep doing and saying the same things over and over again until others accept it as normal. The more they get away with it, the more it becomes normalized. The more it becomes normalized, the less they might be challenged. And the less they're challenged, the less guilt they have to feel. And this is one of the reasons behind why they continually grind others down. Now, that being said, it's very rarely a one-size-fits-all answer. It often depends on where someone is on that narcissistic spectrum, their life experiences, the situation, as well as the other person or people who are involved. But when it comes to guilt, regardless of where they are on that spectrum, narcissistic people tend to have their own moral code, and this often changes depending on the situation, the audience, sometimes even their mood. They also tend to have double standards, and they can criticize, even condemn others for doing the very things they do themselves. Because when they do it, there are mitigating circumstances. There is a reason for it. Either that or it's someone else's fault. But whenever others do it, there is no excuse. They're just bad, and that's all there is to it. And what we often see is not just a rejection of responsibility, but also a rejection of reality. Now, there are those at the extreme end of the narcissistic personality spectrum who may never feel any guilt or remorse for their actions at all. They believe that they're entitled to do whatever they like because they're special, and to hell with the casualties. But many, typically mid-range narcissists, can experience guilt. That being said, it's usually shallow and short-lived. So they might feel guilt at the moment they do or say something and they see the impact of it. They might think, bloody hell, I've went too far this time. However, the feeling is very quickly rejected because their maladaptive, self-prioritizing defense mechanisms kick in. With narcissism, there is also a lack of empathy for other people. Now, it's a lack of empathy, but not no empathy. And this means they can see how their behaviours can hurt others, but they might not fully understand why it's an issue, or they just don't care. Because they prioritize their own needs and demands over everything and everyone else. So for instance, if they were caught cheating, well, there can be a fleeting feeling of guilt, but their own desires and their own false self-image is much more important than other people, never mind moral accountability. Also, what happens is the feeling of guilt quickly turns to shame, because not only are they thinking about the consequences of what they've done, but they know that you are as well. And this might bring up a fear of being exposed to other people who will be thinking about it as well. So there can be a fear of being seen as being bad, flawed, not being in control, or whatever it is. But rather than learn from their regret, they recalibrate their moral compass and their responsibility becomes externalized. For instance, if they were caught cheating, well, the person they cheated with seduced them, made them do it. Or the partner is inadequate somehow, so they were driven into the arms of someone else. What they do is they begin to rewrite the narrative where they are either the hurt party or just an innocent bystander in their own life. But whatever it was they did or said that caused pain, they can go through all manner of mental gymnastics to try to rationalize why it had to happen, why they had to do or say whatever it was. And here's a strange thing. Even if they don't get to tell the version they've created to the person they hurt, they will tell anyone who will listen, even complete strangers. Because to a narcissist, the more times they tell it, the more true it becomes. Now, sometimes if they do go too far and there is a fear of consequences, perhaps maybe losing you forever, well, there may be a long-winded, over-dramatized apology. Sometimes it might even be posted on social media for everyone to read. Now, they might not necessarily mention what actually happened, but they might talk about how deeply sorry they are, how much they regret what happened, how they just want the world to end and they never meant to hurt you. You might even hear things like they've no right to ask for forgiveness, and then go on to ask you for forgiveness. But I would suggest in many cases this is more about mitigation rather than feeling genuine remorse. Narcissists fear social disapproval, so if they're unable to weasel their way out of something through blame shifting or whatever, they'll pretend they can't live with themselves because they're so awful. So here we would see the damaged, flawed, misunderstood hero trying to make amends, and you're the villain for not forgiving them. Other times, you're not going to get an apology of any kind, or even an acknowledgement of the impact of their behaviour, but rather you'll get an explanation of why it had to happen and how they feel about it. Because any guilt they may feel rarely deepens into genuine remorse. Instead, it tends to morph into shame, and this is often at the core of narcissistic personality. But the shame is less about a moral feeling and more about threats to their self-image. Because for a narcissist, shame is intensely uncomfortable and must be rejected because it clashes with their need for superiority, which is why they often tend to live in denial. Now, further down the line, at some point in the future, guilt may still come up from time to time. But again, even though whatever happened was historic, it is still rejected and rewritten for a version that suits them. So, as a brief summary, narcissists may feel shallow, short-term guilt, and it's usually tied to external consequences rather than a sense of deep remorse. And the guilt turns into shame very quickly, but it is typically over threats about how others might see them, threats to their self-image, rather than a moral feeling. And they often deflect, rationalize, contort reality, rather than process and learn from it, which is why they keep doing the same things over and over again. Sometimes they just learn different ways to do the same thing. Now, as always, if there's anything you might like to add, please use the comments section. There are some interesting conversations start from these videos. I'm Darren McGee, and if you find this topic to be helpful, please consider subscribing to my channel, and until next time, thanks for watching.